I never thought I'd hear such venom aimed at my 12-year-old son, a boy in a wheelchair who's never hurt a soul. But there she was, HOA Karen, standing in the middle of our quiet cul-de-sac with her manicured finger jabbing the air, shouting, "You're nothing but a burden. Get out of this neighborhood." My hands clenched so tight I could feel my nails digging into my palms. Neighbors froze mid-step, some pulling out their phones, others staring in shock. I didn't yell back. I didn't have to, because what Karen didn't know was that I had every word, every cruel smirk, captured on video, and that in less than 48 hours, someone would knock on her door who would make her wish she'd never opened her mouth. My name's Michael Turner. I'm a retired U.S. Army engineer, now working as a civil construction consultant. My wife, Emily, and I moved to this quiet suburban neighborhood in Virginia about 6 months ago, hoping to give our 12-year-old son, Jacob, a safe and comfortable place to grow up. Jacob's been in a wheelchair ever since a car accident 3 years ago. He's a bright kid, loves astronomy, can tell you the phases of the moon by heart, but everyday life isn't always easy for him. That's why we picked this place. The neighborhood brochures bragged about community spirit and family-friendly amenities, and the photos showed wide sidewalks and accessible driveways. On moving day, I thought we'd lucked out. Our new house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, with big oak trees shading the front yard. The neighbors waved as we unloaded the truck, but it didn't take long for me to notice the one house in the middle of the block that seemed different. Perfectly trimmed hedges, not a leaf out of place, flower beds that looked like they belonged in a magazine, and a small sign by the door, HOA President. That was my first introduction to Karen Whitfield. Karen was in her early 50s, with bleached blonde hair styled into a helmet-like bob and a wardrobe full of bright, expensive-looking blouses. Her smile was tight, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. On our second day, she came over holding a clipboard and a welcome packet from the HOA. The packet was full of rules, everything from the height of your lawn grass to the exact shade of beige your mailbox had to be painted. I thanked her politely, but she lingered on our front porch, eyeing the wooden ramp I had built for Jacob. "You know," she said, tilting her head, "ramps aren't exactly in keeping with the neighborhood's aesthetic. We prefer uniformity." I bit my tongue. "It's a legal requirement." I said evenly, "My son uses a wheelchair." Her lips tightened. "Well, I'll let it slide for now. Just keep it neat." That should have been my first red flag. For the first few months, I did my best to keep things cordial. We mowed the lawn, kept the driveway clear, even attended one of the HOA meetings, though Karen ran it like a courtroom, barking orders and shutting down any suggestion she didn't like. Most of the neighbors seemed intimidated by her. A few even whispered to me that Karen had been HOA president for over a decade and treated the position like her personal kingdom. Then came the incident in the cul-de-sac. It was a sunny Saturday morning, and Jacob and I had gone to the car to grab his telescope from the trunk. He had been begging me all week to take him stargazing that night. I parked in the handicap spot right next to our driveway, a spot clearly marked with bright blue paint and the universal wheelchair symbol. Jacob was laughing, telling me how he'd read that Saturn's rings would be especially visible. That's when Karen's silver SUV screeched to a halt beside us. She rolled down the window and shouted, "Why are you in that space?" "Those are for people who really need them." I stared at her, dumbfounded. "Karen, it's a handicapped spot. For my son." She got out of the car, heels clicking against the pavement, and marched right up to us. "I've lived here long enough to know your tricks. Your kid can walk just fine. I've seen him in the yard." Jacob's smile faded instantly. My protective instincts kicked in, but I kept my voice calm. "Jacob can stand for a few seconds. That doesn't mean he can walk. And it doesn't mean he doesn't need his chair." Karen scoffed and stepped closer, pointing a manicured finger right at my son's face. "This is why our neighborhood is going downhill. People like you taking advantage, milking the system." I could see neighbors peeking through their blinds. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from fury. Without saying a word, I slipped my phone out of my pocket, opened the camera, and hit record. Karen didn't notice. She kept going, tossing out words I won't repeat, words that no adult should ever say to a child. Jacob sat frozen in his chair, his small hands gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. Finally, she spun on her heel, muttering, "This is going in my next HOA report." She climbed back into her SUV and roared off, tires squealing. I knelt down next to Jacob. "You okay, buddy?" He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't. His eyes were glassy, his lips pressed together. That was the moment I knew I wasn't going to let this slide. Back inside, I replayed the video, every vile word crystal clear. It wasn't just an insult, it was harassment. And given what I knew about federal disability rights laws, it was also illegal. I sat down at my desk and pulled out a notepad. If Karen thought she could intimidate us, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community that night. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jacob's face the way his smile had crumpled under Karen's words. My wife, Emily, tried to reassure me, saying maybe Karen had just had a bad day. But I knew better. I'd seen this type before in the Army people who thrived on power trips, who believed rules only applied when it benefited them. The next morning, I printed the video stills and saved multiple copies of the footage in case someone tried to delete them. I even uploaded one copy to cloud storage under a folder labeled Evidence. It felt like overkill, but with people like Karen, overkill was just smart planning. By Monday, the neighborhood grapevine was buzzing. One of my neighbors, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Latham, caught me on my morning walk. "Michael," she said in a hushed voice, "I saw what happened the other day. That woman has been trouble for years. You stand your ground, son." Her words lit a spark. If Karen had a history of bullying, then maybe I wasn't her only target. Sure enough, later that afternoon, I found an anonymous note in my mailbox. "If you ever want to talk about Karen, we've got stories. Call me lot number 12. I tucked the note into my pocket, but before I could follow up, a letter from the HOA arrived with Karen's name printed at the bottom. The letter accused me of improper use of community parking, claimed my ramp was an unauthorized structure, and gave me 14 days to bring my property into compliance or face fines of $250 per day. I read it twice, then handed it to Emily. "She's doubling down," I said. Emily's jaw tightened. "She's poking the wrong bear." That night, I went to see the neighbor from lot number 12. His name was Tom Keegan, a Vietnam vet with a handshake that could crack knuckles. Over a couple of beers in his garage, Tom told me about the time Karen fined him for having an American flag slightly faded from the sun. Another neighbor had been written up for having a garden gnome that clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic. The more stories I heard, the more I realized Karen wasn't just controlling, she was malicious. But here's where it got interesting. Tom mentioned that last year, a family with a wheelchair-bound grandfather had moved out after repeated run-ins with Karen. They'd threatened to sue for discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act ADA, but the HOA quietly paid them to settle and made them sign an NDA. I almost dropped my beer. This wasn't just about my son anymore. This was a pattern. And patterns meant leverage. The next day, I called a friend of mine from my military days who now worked as a legal consultant. I explained the situation, and he immediately told me to document everything: dates, times, witnesses, and especially any violations of ADA requirements. He reminded me that federal law was crystal clear: public and shared spaces, including HOA-managed parking, must provide accessible accommodations without harassment or obstruction. "Michael," he said, "what she did isn't just morally wrong, it's a federal offense." Hearing those words out loud flipped a switch in me, so I started building my case. I printed every letter and email from the HOA. I kept a log of every interaction with Karen, no matter how small. When Jacob and I went out for errands, I discreetly clipped a GoPro to my jacket, just in case she tried another stunt. And then she did. It was Thursday afternoon. Jacob and I were pulling into the handicapped space again when Karen's SUV slid in ahead of us, blocking the spot entirely. She stepped out, pretending to check her mailbox while her car idled in place. I waited for a minute, then honked. She turned slowly, smirking, and waved like she hadn't seen me. Then she leaned against her SUV, arms crossed, as if daring me to do something. I got out of my truck, recording the whole time. "Karen, you're blocking the handicap spot." She shrugged. "It's only for a minute. Besides, you can use one of the regular spaces, not without unloading a wheelchair ramp," I said. "Which I can't do with you in the way." She rolled her eyes. "You're so dramatic." I didn't argue. I just filmed. Jacob sat quietly in the truck, watching the exchange. Finally, she huffed, climbed back into her SUV, and drove off, but not before muttering something nasty about free rides and special treatment. That was it. I had more than enough to escalate. That evening, I sat at my desk with the evidence spread out in front of me, video clips, witness statements, HOA letters, and screenshots of ADA regulations. I knew exactly who to send it all to. And the best part, Karen had no idea that the person on the receiving end of that package had the power to make her life very, very complicated. By the time she found out, the knock on her door would send her reeling. 2 days after I mailed the evidence packet, the neighborhood felt different. Karen wasn't her usual chirpy, fake smiling self. I noticed her peeking through the blinds when I drove by. And she seemed to avoid the cul-de-sac unless she was behind the wheel of her SUV, windows rolled up. But that didn't mean she'd backed off. Oh no, if anything, she doubled down in writing. On Monday morning, I found not one but 3 envelopes from the HOA shoved into my mailbox. Each one was an infraction notice. Citing petty nonsense, my trash bin was visible from the street. It wasn't. My mailbox paint was fading. It wasn't. And my ramp was non-compliant. It was built to ADA specifications. I couldn't help but smirk. She was making my case stronger without even realizing it. Emily, though, was less amused. "Michael, she's harassing us. I hate that Jacob has to see this." "I know," I said, stacking the letters neatly in my evidence file. "But the more she pushes, the harder she'll fall." Later that week, Karen took her pettiness public. At the HOA monthly meeting, which she ran like a small-town mayor, she brought up ongoing issues with certain residents abusing community privileges. She never said my name, but every eye in that room turned toward me. I sat there calmly, letting her ramble on about fairness and order while she waved a copy of the HOA bylaws like a preacher with a Bible. She had no idea I was recording the entire meeting. Midway through, Tom Keegan, my Vietnam vet neighbor, raised his hand. "Madam President, are you aware that targeting a disabled child could put this HOA in violation of federal law?" The room went silent. Karen's eyes narrowed. "This is not about disability, Tom. This is about rules." Tom leaned back in his chair. "That's not what the videos say." I thought Karen might explode right then and there, but instead she plastered on a brittle smile and changed the subject. Still, I could see it in her eyes. She was rattled. The next morning, she tried a new tactic: intimidation. As I was wheeling Jacob down the driveway to catch the school bus, Karen marched up with a clipboard. "I'm here to conduct a property inspection," she announced. I glanced at my watch. At 7:30 in the morning, without notice, it's within my rights as HOA president. She snapped. "No, it's not," I said, pulling out my phone. "But go ahead. The camera's rolling." She hesitated, then turned on her heel and stormed off. Jacob looked up at me and whispered, "Dad, she's scared of you now." "Not me," I said, smiling faintly. "She's scared of the truth." That weekend, the real fireworks began. A white sedan with tinted windows rolled into the neighborhood and parked in front of Karen's house. 2 people in suits got out, carrying briefcases. They weren't here to sell vacuum cleaners. Karen must have spotted them from her window, because moments later, she came out onto her porch, waving her hands and laughing like she was greeting old friends. But her laugh faltered when one of them handed her a folder and flashed an ID badge. From across the street, I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could see Karen's face drain of color. She clutched the folder to her chest, nodded quickly, then backed into her house and shut the door without another word. I kept my head down, acted like I hadn't noticed a thing, but inside, I was grinning. The first domino had tipped. Over the next few days, the neighborhood gossip mill went into overdrive. Someone claimed they saw Karen shredding papers late at night. Another said she'd been calling emergency meetings with the rest of the HOA board. And Mrs. Latham swore she overheard Karen on the phone, hissing something about federal jurisdiction and making this go away. She was panicking, and panic makes people sloppy. Case in point, the following Tuesday, I found an email from Karen accidentally forwarded to me. It was meant for the HOA treasurer, and it read, "We need to tighten the budget and prepare for potential legal costs. Certain residents are trying to sabotage the HOA." I printed that email, added it to my file, and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee. Karen still hadn't connected the dots. She didn't know that the suits at her door weren't just any federal investigators. They had a direct line to my family. And when they were done, she wouldn't just be stepping down from her precious HOA position. She'd be lucky if she could even rent a condo without someone Googling her name and finding the headlines. The day she finally figured out who was pulling the strings would be the day she realized her reign was over, and that day was coming fast. Karen thought she was playing chess. She had no idea she was already checkmated. The day after that mysterious white sedan appeared, I got a call from my brother-in-law, Daniel, to the neighborhood. Daniel's just Emily's younger brother who works in D.C. What they don't know is that Daniel is a senior special agent with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, the same branch that enforces the Americans with Disabilities Act. When I'd sent him my evidence package 2 weeks earlier, I wasn't sure how far it would go. Daniel didn't make promises. He just asked for everything I had: videos, letters, meeting recordings, and said he'd look into it. But now, his tone was different. "Mike," he said, "your HOA's in deep. We've got them on multiple counts of ADA violations, plus harassment and retaliation. We're opening a formal federal investigation." I leaned back in my chair. Karen's been doubling down. She's not going to see this coming. Daniel chuckled. She'll see it when I'm standing on her porch. I'll admit, a small part of me wanted to warn her to give her one last chance to stop digging. But then I remembered Jacob's face that day in the cul-de-sac. The insults. The way she pointed her finger in his face like he was less than human. No, she'd crossed the line too many times. That Friday afternoon, Daniel made the trip from D.C. in an unmarked government SUV. Emily had baked cookies for him. She's always been the peacekeeper, but I could see in her eyes that she wanted justice as much as I did. "Ready to do this?" he asked, straightening his tie. We walked the short distance to Karen's pristine two-story, the sun warm on our backs. She was outside, clipping her rose bushes, wearing oversized sunglasses and a floppy sun hat. She saw me first and plastered on that thin-lipped smile. Well, if it isn't our neighborhood's problem child," she said, voice dripping with sarcasm. I didn't reply. Daniel stepped forward, pulling out his badge in one fluid motion. "Karen Whitfield. I'm Special Agent Daniel Harris with the U.S. Department of Justice. We need to speak with you regarding multiple complaints of civil rights violations under the Americans with Disabilities Act." For a moment, she didn't react. Then her clippers slipped from her hand and clattered onto the driveway. What is this about?" she stammered. Daniel's voice was calm but firm. "We have sworn statements, video evidence, and written correspondence showing discriminatory harassment toward a disabled minor in this community, as well as retaliation against his family. This is a formal federal matter. I'd advise you to get legal counsel." Karen's face went pale. She glanced at me, as if I might somehow step in to save her. I just raised my eyebrows. I need to speak to my lawyer," she whispered. "That would be wise," Daniel said. "We'll also need all HOA meeting minutes, violation notices, and correspondence with residents for the past 3 years. You have 72 hours to comply with this request, or we will issue a subpoena." She nodded quickly, then all but fled inside her house. As we walked away, Daniel glanced over at me. "She's going to panic. That's when she'll make mistakes. Keep your phone ready." And panic she did. By that evening, 3 different neighbors texted me that Karen had been calling them, trying to find out if they'd ratted her out. Mrs. Latham said Karen showed up at her door in tears, swearing this was all a misunderstanding and promising to fix the handicap spot issue if everyone just stayed quiet. But the thing about federal investigations, once they start rolling, You can't just fix them with a coat of paint and an apology. Over the next week, Daniel's team quietly interviewed several residents. Tom gave them a statement about the flag incident. The family with the disabled grandfather was contacted about their NDA, and even the HOA treasurer admitted off the record that Karen had pushed through certain fines just to teach people a lesson. Karen tried to keep up appearances. At the next HOA meeting, she wore her brightest red blouse and acted like nothing was wrong, but her voice wavered, and she avoided looking at me. I sat in the back, phone in hand, recording every second. Halfway through the meeting, she announced she was taking a temporary leave of absence due to personal matters. The room went quiet. Everyone knew what that meant. Walking home afterward, I passed her driveway. She was standing there, arms crossed, watching me. For the first time since we'd moved in, she didn't have a smug smile or a snide comment, just a tight, worried frown and maybe, just maybe, a flicker of fear. She knew, but she didn't know the worst part yet, that the investigation was about to dig into more than just the way she treated my son. Karen might have been on temporary leave, but her fingerprints were all over the HOA's past decisions, and Daniel's team was about to dust every one of them for prints. The next morning, Daniel called me. "Mike, you're not going to believe what we just found in the HOA's financial records. Try me. There's a pattern: bogus fines, selectively enforced rules, and in some cases, money that was collected but never deposited into the HOA account. We're talking thousands, and Karen's signature is on all of it." I felt that deep, satisfied burn in my chest, the kind you get when you've been holding your breath for months and finally exhale. So she's not just a bully, she's a thief, too. Looks that way, Daniel said. And theft from a community association that operates across state lines, that puts us into federal fraud territory. Now we had two tracks running in parallel: the ADA violations and the financial crimes. And the best part, Karen had no idea the second one existed yet. That weekend, Daniel suggested we keep our heads down and let the investigation do the work. "You've done your part, Mike. Now let me do mine." But I couldn't help adding fuel to the fire. When I saw Karen in her yard, I made sure to park in the handicapped spot, wheel Jacob down the ramp slowly, and smile at her as we passed. She didn't say a word, just turned away and fiddled with her roses like they were suddenly the most fascinating thing in the world. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood was starting to shift. Without Karen barking orders, the HOA board was actually listening to residents. The vice president, a soft-spoken guy named Paul, stopped by my house one evening to apologize for the treatment we'd received. "I didn't agree with the way Karen handled things," he said, "but she controlled the agenda. We didn't get much say." "Then maybe it's time for a change," I replied. The very next day, Daniel and two other agents paid another visit to Karen's house, this time with a subpoena in hand. I wasn't spying exactly, but let's just say I happened to be working on my lawn when they showed up. Karen opened the door, saw the paperwork, and visibly sagged against the frame. "This is harassment," I heard her protest. "This is a federal investigation," Daniel corrected, his voice steady. "Failure to comply will result in further legal action." She took the papers with a shaking hand. One of the agents asked if they could step inside to discuss the matter privately. Karen glanced around nervously, as if the walls themselves might overhear, then ushered them in. When they left 20 minutes later, Daniel caught my eye from across the street and gave me the smallest nod. It was all I needed to know. Over the next week, the dominoes started to fall faster. The HOA treasurer resigned, citing stress. The vice president called an emergency board meeting, this time without Karen, and voted to suspend all fines against residents until further notice. Neighbors who had been silent for years began sharing their own horror stories, threats, intimidation, baseless penalties. And then came the knock on my door. It was a reporter from the local paper, Mr. Turner. "We're investigating allegations of misconduct by the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. Several residents suggested we speak to you." I didn't give him the videos, those were still part of an active federal case, but I told him exactly what had happened to Jacob and how the HOA had responded. I even gave him a copy of one of Karen's letters, complete with her signature. The article ran 2 days later with the headline, "Local HOA President Under Federal Investigation for Discrimination and Fraud." The picture they used was priceless. Karen in her driveway, mid-blink, mouth half open like she'd just bitten into a lemon. After that, the neighborhood was electric. People whispered in driveways, meetings were packed, and the HOA's phone lines were jammed with calls from angry homeowners. Karen, meanwhile, stopped showing her face entirely. Curtains drawn, car absent from the driveway, mailbox overflowing. But we weren't done. Daniel called me on a Tuesday morning. We're recommending formal charges. Mike, ADA violations, harassment, and multiple counts of financial fraud. The U-Bund attorney's office will take it from here. I leaned back in my chair, letting the words sink in. So, this is it. This is the part where you sit back and watch, he said. And that's exactly what I planned to do, watch as the woman who'd humiliated my son, terrorized my neighbors, and treated the HOA like her personal empire saw it all come crashing down. Little did Karen know, her final humiliation wasn't going to come from the feds, it was going to come from the very people she thought she controlled. The morning of the next HOA meeting, you could feel it in the air, the tension, the anticipation. Normally, these monthly gatherings were half-empty affairs where Karen sat at the head of the table, dictating everything like a monarch addressing her subjects. But that night, the clubhouse was packed. Every folding chair was taken, and people were standing along the walls. Word had spread that the federal investigation was moving forward, and people were expecting fireworks. Karen hadn't attended the last two meetings, citing medical leave, but her name was still officially on the HOA roster. I sat in the back row with Tom Keegan and Mrs. Latham, both of them grinning like kids about to watch the big game. Paul, the acting president, called the meeting to order. He read the agenda, his voice steady but with a current of excitement beneath it. Then, halfway through, the door opened. In walked Karen. She wasn't the immaculately dressed, confident woman we'd seen for years. Her hair was limp, her blouse wrinkled, and her makeup smudged like she'd applied it in a hurry. But she still carried herself like she owned the room, at least until she caught sight of the sheer number of people packed inside. She gave a stiff smile, took her usual seat at the head table, and began rifling through her papers like nothing was wrong. But the murmurs in the crowd didn't stop. Paul cleared his throat. Before we proceed, I need to address some urgent matters concerning our leadership. Karen's head snapped up. Excuse me, Paul, but as HOA president, you're not the president anymore. Paul cut in. The room went dead quiet. Karen blinked. What are you talking about? Paul held up a printed letter. This is a formal resignation submitted on your behalf after the board voted unanimously to remove you for cause, effective immediately. You're being replaced under emergency provisions of our bylaws. Her voice wavered. You can't do that without my consent. Yes, we can, Paul said, flipping to the relevant section of the bylaws. It's right here. And given the pending federal charges and financial audit, it was necessary for the stability of this community. The crowd erupted some clapping, some just nodding in satisfaction. Karen looked around, clearly expecting someone to come to her defense, but no one did. The allies she thought she had were staring at their shoes, unwilling to meet her gaze. Then Tom stood up. Madam, former Madam President, on behalf of every resident you find, harassed, or humiliated over the years, I'd like to say, good riddance. The room broke into applause. Karen's face turned crimson. This is harassment. I've served this community for over a decade, and in return, you used it as your personal piggy bank. Mrs. Latham called out. That got a few laughs. Paul didn't waste time. Karen, you need to leave. Now. This meeting is for board members and residents in good standing. For a second, I thought she might actually refuse, but then she spotted Daniel, leaning casually against the back wall, arms crossed. He wasn't in his federal suit tonight, just jeans and a windbreaker, but she knew exactly who he was. Their eyes met, and whatever defiance she had left seemed to drain out of her. Karen gathered her papers with shaking hands, stuffed them into a tote bag, and walked out without another word. The door closed behind her with a thud that felt final. Paul turned back to the room. As your new president, my first order of business is to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. We're voting tonight on new transparency rules and accessibility improvements. Jacob, who was sitting next to Emily in the front row, beamed when Paul mentioned the accessibility upgrades. It felt like the moment the whole nightmare began to flip into something good. After the meeting, I stepped outside into the cool night air. Karen's SUV was still in the parking lot. She was sitting inside, engine idling, staring straight ahead. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered her words to my son, the way she'd tried to make him feel small. No, this ending was exactly what she'd earned. By the end of the week, the local paper ran a follow-up story. Former HOA president removed amid federal probe. The photo showed her walking away from the clubhouse, head down, clutching her tote bag like a life raft. In the comments section online, residents shared their relief. One person wrote, "It's like a dark cloud has lifted." Another posted simply, "Justice served." But the real kicker was still coming, something Karen didn't see in the meeting and wouldn't know about until it hit her like a freight train in the mail. 3 days after Karen's public removal from the HOA, I was out front raking leaves when I saw the mail truck stop at her house. The carrier got out holding a thick, official-looking envelope, the kind you don't want to see in your mailbox. He walked up, dropped it in her slot, and drove away without so much as a wave. I didn't think much of it until about 20 minutes later when I heard the sound. It started as a muffled yell, then a sharp, panicked scream. I looked up just in time to see Karen fling open her front door. Envelope in hand, her face drained of all color. She scanned the street like she was searching for a lifeline, but the only person outside was me. Our eyes met. She froze, the envelope trembling in her hand, and for a split second I thought she might march across the street to say something, but then her shoulders sagged, and she backed inside, slamming the door hard enough to rattle her windows. I had a pretty good guess what was in that letter. An hour later, Daniel called. "You hear the news? I think I just saw it." I said, "DOJ filed formal charges this morning. ADA violations, harassment, and 3 counts of wire fraud. She'll be facing court in federal district." I let out a slow breath. "That explains the screaming. She's going to try for a plea deal," Daniel continued. "But part of that deal is restitution. That means she'll be paying back every dime she took from the HOA, and some of that will go toward accessibility upgrades for the community." I couldn't help but smile. Poetic justice. By the following week, work crews were already repainting the handicapped spaces and installing new ramps at the clubhouse. The board approved a policy that any future president would have to complete ADA compliance training, something I'd pushed for in the wake of everything. Neighbors who used to keep their heads down started stopping by to chat. Tom brought over a case of beer one Friday night, saying, "Here's to finally living in a neighborhood worth living in." Mrs. Latham baked Jacob a pie. As for Jacob, he seemed lighter somehow. He still remembered what Karen had said to him, but he also saw that it hadn't broken us, that we'd stood up, fought back, and won. One afternoon, as we wheeled his telescope into the yard for a clear night of stargazing, he looked at me and said, "Dad, do you think she learned her lesson?" I paused, adjusting the tripod. "I don't know, buddy, but I know she won't ever get the chance to do it to someone else again." The best part, that sense of unease we'd lived with since moving here was gone. The air felt lighter, the neighborhood quieter, and not in the fake, Karen-approved way. This was real peace. The day the moving truck showed up in front of her house, I didn't go over. I didn't gloat. I just watched from my porch as she loaded the last of her things, got into her SUV, and drove away without a single goodbye. Emily came out beside me, slipping her arm through mine. "Over?" she asked. "Over," I said. But in truth, it wasn't just over, it was settled. Balance restored. Justice served. Sometimes, life puts people in your path who seem determined to make it harder, people who thrive on control, intimidation, and making others feel small. It's tempting to fight fire with fire, but the most powerful weapon you have is the truth. When you stand up, document everything, and lean on the right people, you take away the power those bullies think they hold. This wasn't just about my son or my family. It was about setting a precedent that no one, not even an HOA president, is above the law. And seeing justice done doesn't just help the victim. It sends a message to every would-be bully watching. If you've ever faced someone like Karen, I hope this story reminds you that your voice matters. Share your story, stand your ground, and never let anyone make you feel less than you are. Drop a comment if you've dealt with an HOA nightmare. Hit that like button if you believe in standing up for what's right, and don't forget to subscribe for more true justice stories.